I hear my name, my Lord is calling me. I can hear him calling my name. I hear my name, my Lord is calling me. He calls me by my name. He leads the way, he leads me all the way with joy and happiness every day. Jump, jump, shout, shout, praise the Lord. I hear him calling my name. He calls me all the time. He's always on my mind. I need him every day. When he's here to show me the way. Well, he's my friend. He's my friend. My God. He's my God. And from him I'll never hide. Jump, jump, shout, shout, praise the Lord as I hear him calling my name. I hear my name, my Lord is calling me. I can hear him calling my name. I hear my name, my Lord is calling me. He calls me by my name. He leads the way, he leads me all the way with joy and happiness every day. Jump, jump, shout, shout, praise the Lord as I hear him calling my name. When our days are dark and gray, all I do is call him. He makes my pathway bright, and he's here to show me the light. Well, he's my friend. He's my friend. My God. He's my God. From him. And from him I'll never hide. Jump, jump, shout, shout, praise the Lord. Jump, shout, shout, praise the Lord. Jump, shout, praise the Lord. I hear him calling my name.
And this morning we read these words from Luke. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for now you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to the shore, they left everything and followed him.
So as we begin our time of taking a closer look at this prominent disciple of Jesus, I want to start by just giving you some general information about Simon that you might not be aware of. And then we'll get into how this simple fisherman became a disciple of Jesus Christ, the call of Simon Peter. I think that there are some real takeaways for us, even us who have been following Jesus for a very long time, as we look at this call of Simon Peter's. He was not born Simon Peter, of course. His name was actually Simon Bar Jonah. Bar meaning son of. So he was Simon, son of Jonah. Jonah, his father, was a fisherman. Simon grew up in Bethsaida, which is on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And Bethsaida literally means house of fishermen. It was a fishing village, as were many villages along that seashore. Simon learned to fish from his father, and by the time we meet him in the Gospels, he and his brother Andrew have taken over the fishing business. Together, they own a boat. Evidence would suggest that this boat would have been about 26 feet long. Several years ago, during a time of drought, people in the area of Capernaum discovered this wood sticking up out of the sand, and when they dug down, they found the remains of a fishing boat. The wood in that boat was carbon dated to the 1st century, and this boat was 26 feet long. That is why we think that that's probably about the length of Simon's boat as well. It was probably the size of most fishing boats during that time. Well, Simon marries a girl from Capernaum, and he moves his fishing business from Bethsaida to Capernaum. Now, that was unusual. Usually, when there was a marriage, the woman would leave her family and her village, and she would move with her husband. But that's not the case here. And the reason that some people think that Simon may have been willing to move from Bethsaida to Capernaum is that for some reason taxes were less on the Capernaum side of the lake than they were on the Bethsaida side of the lake. So it was financially better for Simon to move to his wife's village. We know that Simon lived in a home with his wife and her mother and his brother Andrew. In the 1st century, the standard staple food for people was fish. The wealthy were able to afford fresh fish, which they would grill, but most people couldn't afford that. They ate dried, salted, or pickled fish as their standard food. Most fishermen who lived around the Sea of Galilee were simple people who tried to eke out a living from the sea. And the Gospels never give us the impression that Simon was wealthy. But in excavations that have been done in the city of Capernaum, there is speculation about what kind of house Simon may have lived in, and especially what size of house he may have lived in. A large synagogue has been uncovered in these excavations, and not far from the synagogue is a relatively large octagonal building that they have dated to the 4th century. Now, 8-sided buildings from the 4th century were almost always Roman churches. The number 8 symbolized perfection and also the 8th day of the week, or the day of resurrection. We call resurrection the 3rd day, but they counted from Palm Sunday. So they had Palm Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Saturday. Easter Sunday was the 8th day of the week. So many churches from that particular period of time were built in this 8-sided shape. And underneath this 4th century church is a 3rd century church, a little bit smaller. And under that church is a house, a bit larger than you might imagine. Now we know that they often built churches on sites that were sacred. If you go to the Holy Land, and I know some of you have been there, oftentimes you will see that a famous church has actually been built on a site that is sacred for some reason. So what site was holy or sacred in Capernaum? Simon's house. Perhaps it was his wife's family home, the house where Jesus likely would have stayed whenever he was in that area during his years of ministry. Being a fisherman required a lot of hard work in those days. You would fish all night, rowing and casting a net over the water, hauling it up to separate out the good fish from the junk fish, and then throw it out again. You would spend the early morning hours of the day mending your nets and cleaning all the vegetation off of them. You would haul your catch to the market, and then you would try to catch some sleep before going out to do the same thing all over again. So when we try to imagine Simon, when we try to picture him in our minds, we can picture a man with very calloused hands, a man with muscles built up over years of hard physical labor. He was most likely a man who worked hard, who was educated in the practical kind of education, how to make a living from fishing. And he was a man who would work to take care of his family, probably complain about taxes, probably hope that life would get better someday. He was an ordinary man. There is nothing exceptional about Simon the fisherman. He was certainly not perfect, nor was he powerful in any way. So how did this ordinary fisherman end up being one of the preeminent figures of the Gospels? How did Simon Bar-Jonah become the Apostle Peter, leader of the church? It starts with a call. And when I think of Jesus calling Simon and Andrew, his brother, and then James and John, their fishing partners or friends at least, I usually think of that limited few verses that we have in Matthew where we are told that Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee and saw these men by their boats, and he called them to follow him, and they immediately left everything and followed Jesus. And I don't find very much in that version that I can relate to. It just seems pretty strange that 4 men would just up and leave everything they know to follow some stranger who walked by and said, "Follow me." But if you look at all of the gospel accounts and you try to piece them together, you begin to see that there was a lot more to it than what Matthew gives us in his gospel. And we have to remember when we read the gospels that each of these writers was writing to a certain group of people, and they had a mission for what they wanted to get across, and they only write what they believe is necessary for us to know. Several centuries later, we find ourselves mightily wishing that they had filled in a few more gaps. But what we do know when we look at the Gospel of John is that Andrew had somehow at some point learned about the ministry and the preaching of John the Baptist. Andrew had gone to hear John preach, and most likely he had dragged his brother Simon along with him. The brothers may very well have been baptized by John, since we are told that Andrew stays a while to become one of John's disciples. And John the Baptist points Andrew and his friend John toward Jesus, following Jesus' baptism. And he says to them, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." In other words, there is the Messiah that you are looking for. And then we are told that Andrew and John begin to follow Jesus. They stay with him for a day, and then Andrew goes and gets his brother Simon, and he says, "You need to come and see this. We have found the Messiah." And he takes Simon to meet Jesus. Jesus, John tells us, takes one look at Simon and says, "You are Simon, son of Jonah, but you will be called the Rock." You will be called Cephas in the Aramaic, or Petros in the Greek, or as we call him now, Peter, the Rock. Jesus does that from time to time. He gives people nicknames, and that was a relatively common practice at that time. It usually had something to do with someone's character or their personality. Jesus looked at the brothers James and John and said, "You two are sons of thunder." He could tell that with a look. But Simon became the Rock. After this initial meeting, Simon and Andrew and James and John apparently all go back to Capernaum, back to their fishing business, and Jesus goes into the wilderness to be tempted. At the end of his 40 days of trial, Jesus makes his way to Capernaum to teach and to preach in the synagogue. Week after week he is there, and perhaps these 4 fishermen come to the synagogue to hear what he has to say. It is possible, it is even likely, that Jesus lives with Simon Peter and his family while he is in Capernaum. He already knows them. Andrew stayed with him for an entire day. They have a connection there, and there aren't hotels back in those days. Jesus may very well have lived with them for some time. And one day Jesus returns from the synagogue and finds Simon's mother-in-law deathly ill with a fever. Simon asks Jesus if he can do something to help. He has most likely heard and seen Jesus heal others, and now he wonders, can Jesus help his family? Jesus prays for Simon's mother-in-law, and immediately she is healed. Now think what kind of impression that may have left on this fisherman, Simon. So there are all of these encounters with Jesus before we get to the events of our lesson today. And when you see it laid out like that, it makes it a bit easier to see how these fishermen could have and would have been willing to leave everything they know to walk with this person that they also know. It wasn't quite so sudden. Jesus has developed a relationship with these four fishermen, especially Simon, and it fits a lot more with what I know and have experienced with discipleship and conversion. More often than not, discipleship or someone coming to make a decision to follow Jesus Christ happens over a period of time as a relationship is built, not so suddenly. So in today's gospel, we find these fishermen after a disappointing night of fishing. Out all night, no fish. How many of you can identify with that? It might not be all night, it might be all day. They're out for a good amount of time, no fish. It can be discouraging. But imagine if this was your livelihood. This was what you needed in order to feed your family. Imagine they had worked all night and they made nothing. By the way, have any of you ever wondered why they fished at night? Fishermen in Galilee still fish with nets at night. And the reason they say is that the fish can see the nets in the day. They really believe that the fish can see the nets in the day and won't swim into them. They go out, nowadays they go out at night and they hang lanterns over the water with the nets in the water, and the fish are drawn to the surface by the light, and then they catch them with their nets. So Simon's back from a night of fishing, no fish. He has his boat moored just off the shore, perhaps tied to a rock, and he and Andrew and James and John are on shore cleaning all the vegetation out of their nets so they won't rot. Now, I would imagine that all they want to do is to go home, get something in their stomachs, and get some rest. At any rate, we can easily imagine that they are tired and probably a little discouraged. And along comes Jesus with a large crowd of people who have gathered to hear him teach. And what does Jesus do? He steps right into Simon's boat. And he says, "Hey, Simon, could you push your boat out a little ways so that I can better teach these people?" A lot of you live on the lakes and you know how sound carries over the lake. In those days, everyone who lived by the lake would have known that you can speak from a boat 50 yards out and people can actually hear you better because the water acts as a sounding board. Now, I have often heard Adam Hamilton, who is the pastor at the Church of the Resurrection, say that Jesus loves to borrow our stuff. Jesus isn't shy about asking to use what we have at our disposal to accomplish his work. In many ways, about many things, Jesus can say to us, "I could use that if you'll let me." Maybe it's something as simple as your tools when you see somebody stranded on the side of the road. Maybe it's your time when you see somebody struggling and needing someone to talk to. Maybe it's a skill that you have that could benefit someone else. Jesus needed to use Simon's boat, and he isn't shy about asking to use it. He steps right in it, says, "Simon, please, row me a ways out from shore so I can use your boat to teach these people." I think it's worthwhile for us to consider this morning, what is your boat? What do you have that Jesus might be asking to use in order to accomplish his purposes? When does Jesus say to you, "If you'll let me, I could use that to further my work in the world"? Our quilters have a display set up out in the narthex this morning, hoping that some of you will stop by and see what it is they do and decide if you would like to be a part of it as they get ready to start a new year. But several years ago, my understanding is that Rogine Cummins had retired from nursing. She had served as our parish nurse for some years here at the church, but along the way, she had learned a thing or two, or quite a lot actually, about quilting. And she was discovering that that was where her passion was leading her. And Rogine could have stayed home and made lots and lots of beautiful quilts for her family and her friends, but she felt like Jesus was leading her to do a little bit more than that. And so, along with some others in the church, she started this quilting ministry. Now, when I first came here, I heard about a woman named Carol, who was home dying of melanoma. And my impression from visiting with people in the church and from visiting with Carol herself was that she had been a rather lonely and maybe even lost person who had found a home here at Hubbard and in the quilting group, even as she was struggling with her cancer. What a gift that ministry was for her. A few years ago, the quilting group learned that dialysis patients here in town and also as far away as Cass Lake struggle with fatigue and get extremely cold as they go through that procedure. Now, every dialysis patient gets their own quilt or a fleece blanket to help them be warm and comfortable during those difficult days. That comes from our quilting group. Many of you who have been injured or sick, as well as many people outside of our church who have experienced one kind of tragedy or another, have received comfort in the form of a quilt. And I think much of it can go back to Rogine listening when Jesus said, you know, I can use that skill to accomplish my purposes in this world, if you'll let me. One thing I have realized, and that this lesson reveals, is that Jesus doesn't always pick the most opportune times to ask to borrow our stuff. Oftentimes we can feel like, you know what, I have too much in my life right now. I'm too busy today. I don't really want to do that. I have other plans for that stuff. And yet Jesus continues to nudge us. I can use that to accomplish my purposes in the world, if you'll let me. And what I have discovered is that Jesus' purposes are usually much higher than my purposes were when I let him. So now here's Simon. He is sitting behind Jesus in his boat, probably with his oar stuck in the mud to hold the boat in place, and he is a captive audience as Jesus teaches the crowd. He has to stay awake in order to hold the boat in place, and there's nothing to do but listen to what Jesus is saying. Now, I kind of wonder whether Jesus is most concerned about the people hearing his message or about Simon hearing his message. I don't know, probably both. But isn't it interesting that we know that Jesus gave this whole message, this whole block of teaching, a sermon, if you will, and Luke doesn't tell us one thing about what he taught. We don't even get the highlights of what Jesus spoke about in that boat. I believe that when Luke was writing this chapter, Simon was the message that Luke wanted us to hear. After he finished his teaching, Jesus told Simon to row the boat out further. Now, I'd like you to imagine that. Simon has already fished all night, and he is tired, and he's cleaned his nets. They're clean. They're drying in the sun. He's already patiently waited there while Jesus taught, and now Jesus says, row your boat out and throw the nets. I can hear Simon thinking, seriously, Jesus? Do you even know anything about fishing? Have you ever fished? Because we all know you don't fish in the daytime. You fish at night. Aren't you a carpenter? But Simon doesn't say any of that. At least Luke doesn't tell us about any of that. Simon pushes back a little bit. He says, Master, we have fished all night, and we caught nothing. But then he adds what might just be the most important line in this whole passage. But because you say so, I will do it. Simon speaks a truth that I have found to characterize so much of discipleship. How many times do we feel a nudge to do something, or to say something, or to get involved in something, or to reach out maybe beyond what is our comfort zone, and we can come up with 1,000 good reasons why we should say no. And there is only one reason to say yes, because Jesus said so. Out of those 1,001 reasons, that's the only one that counts. Because Jesus said so. Have you ever felt like Jesus was calling you to do something and you really aren't sure if it'll make any difference anyway? You know you're already overextended. You know it's something you don't feel particularly good at doing. You know there are other good things you could do. There are 1,000 excellent reasons to say no, and one reason to say yes. And that reason is more important than all of the other excellent reasons, because Jesus said, do it. The most amazing times in life can happen in the interruptions. Those times when we think we're just way too busy to do that, but we let ourselves do it and we find that we have been incredibly blessed by doing it. I am pretty positive that Simon rowed out to those deep waters and let down his nets just knowing that this was all a waste of time and energy, only to be blown away by a catch that was bigger than he had ever seen, a catch so huge his nets were splitting. Now we are told that Simon's response is to fall on his knees right there in his boat and say, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinner." We watch that moment that Simon realizes that his little brother Andrew was right all those weeks ago when he said, "We have found the Messiah." What kind of person has the power to call the fish of the sea up to the surface to fill the nets? No mere mortal, that's for sure. Only the creator of those fish. This, I believe, was a crucial lesson for Simon to learn very early on, and for all of us who would also follow Jesus. Fishing for a living is hard work. It takes commitment, it takes investment, it takes perseverance, it takes skill. It can break your heart, and as we read in our lesson today, it can leave you hungry in the morning. Fishing for people is even harder. And it too takes commitment, and it takes investment, and it takes perseverance, and it takes skill. Jesus has uniquely gifted each one of us to have a part in this movement of bringing people back into harmony with God and with one another. But without the guidance and the direction and the power of Jesus Christ, it is still impossible. With Jesus' help, miracles can happen. That person that you thought would never come around or open their heart suddenly does. And you might have said or done a lot of things along the way to help lead them there, but it is the work of the Holy Spirit that brings the person to that point. And Simon needed to know that, and we need to hear that as well. It is right here at this moment that Jesus says to Simon Peter, "Don't be afraid. Follow me, and I will lead you to fish for people." And now, these 4 fishermen get their boats back to shore and leave everything to follow Jesus. Jesus continues to teach, to challenge, to pursue us, to ask to borrow our stuff, to show himself to us and share himself with us, all the while calling us to trust him enough to follow him, to let Jesus lead the way. And the response is completely ours to make. So I ask you this morning, do we have the faith of a simple fisherman? Have we experienced enough of Jesus to say, what is mine is yours, and where you lead, I will follow? If this is you, then our prayer this morning is a very simple one. It is one word that you can say in your heart, and that word is yes. Yes, I will follow you. Yes, I want to be your disciple. Yes, you can use my boat whenever you need to. Yes, I want to fish for people. Yes, I want to be part of your movement to bless people and heal this broken world. Yes. Let us pray. Help us, Lord, to be your faithful people. to respond to your nudging, to keep our eyes and ears and hearts and hands open, that we might see and hear the needs and spread your love. Help us to let go of what you need to borrow, whether that be our time, a skill that we have, a resource that you can use to bless someone. Help us do all of these things, even when we don't feel like it, even when we have 1,000 excellent reasons to say no. Help us to remember that when you say so, that is all it takes. As Jesus taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.